Hi, I'm Cassie, and I'll be reviewing Deliverance by James Dickey. And I'm excited to be getting my book review out of the way early in the semester. I'm really glad we were assigned to read Deliverance. It's not something that I would normally have picked up, but I am glad that I broke free from my typical genre and got to read something interesting and really good. The thing I dislike maybe the most about college is that I'm never able to read for pleasure anymore, and so it was kind of a treat being able to read a novel for class. As I read Deliverance, I had to keep reminding myself that this was written over 50 years ago. It didn't feel old to me, and I kind of wanted to explore why that was. Another take I had was related to masculinity in the text and how it travels through the entire plot. So my thesis was that James Dickey cleverly presents a timeless critique on arrogant masculinity that withstands both trials and years. The plot is that four men, Ed, Lewis, Bobby, and Drew, go into the wilderness down a river to break free from their normal daily routines and test their physical grit. Then, of course, things don't go as planned. From the beginnings, there are some manly norms that are set with those characters. Number one is that they use nature for their own purposes. They use nature to feel better about the lives that they've chosen to live. Their plan is to go and dominate the river. They really want to get out of their ruts. Ed, especially, who is the narrator, so we know more about him, is very dissatisfied with his life, even though it's exactly what he has chosen to do. He is irritated by his mundane job and by his wife, who has done nothing wrong, who has been completely faithful and loyal and tried her best to make him happy. So they want to go into nature and to prove themselves. They want to use nature to prove themselves. And the other thing, number two, is that they're pretty dismissive of others. We know that Ed objectifies women. He makes some pretty lewd comments about appearances, and he also, when they are going out into the wilderness, they stop and meet some locals, and he calls them inconsequential, implying that he is consequential, but they don't have value. And he says that there's something wrong with all country people. Both of those things we talked about in class, but I want to discuss how those themes really endure through the whole novel. I call Deliverance timeless in one sense because I think this story could take place right now. In Deliverance, there are only a few tells about the 1970s setting. Ed's work doesn't seem to have any computers in it, even though it definitely would if it were set today. There's an absence of cell phones or smartphones. Ed has this Ghostbusters kind of outfit, I think, that he wears through the whole trip, which obviously would not be fashionable today. And then there's one scene with a phone booth, which Dickey seems to, in his tone, make a little bit ominous about where technology is headed. So, a lot of modern books and movies have to build reasons into their plots why the protagonist wouldn't just pull out their smartphone to call for help or Google directions. But with Deliverance, these excuses are kind of automatic. They're kind of built into the plot. It would be easy to explain because they wouldn't have any phone service, and their phones easily would have been lost in the river along with all their other possessions. Another reason I think the plot is timeless is how masculinity has changed very slowly over time. In many cultures throughout history, young men have taken to the wilderness to test themselves. Kind of think vision quests. But specifically with the Spartans, who were famous for their agoge, which was their 13-year training period that transitioned them from young boys into men. They sent their warriors out for an entire year to be isolated and separated from one another and from society. Just as a side note, the Spartans also did a lot of male rape, and I kind of wondered when I was researching if Dickey was aware of the Spartans and kind of had this in mind as he was writing. When I was in my early 20s, my male friends would often go on these like male bonding, no girls allowed trips, camping, or like dangerous kayaking right after it rained a lot. And at the time, I kind of thought this was dumb or like maybe mildly annoying. But now when I look back, I really kind of see it as kind of toxic. This could be an old story. Deliverance could be something that happened a really long time ago, or it could be something that happened today. As a reader, I hoped Ed and the others would be broken of their aggressive masculinity, but when Drew is killed and Lewis is injured, Ed takes a unexpected leadership role, and Dickey uses really surprising language to describe Ed's thoughts as he confronts these super extreme circumstances. Ed is flung down the river and he describes it as terrifyingly enjoyable. At the beginning of his climb up the cliff, his heart expands with joy. And as he's climbing, he feels more and more tenderness toward the wall. Stuck in a crevice, Ed's arrow points are cutting at him, and he calls it good pain. And he says fear and a kind of moon-blazing sexuality lift him up the rocks. And then when his own arrow lodges in his side, he calls it freedom. His pain is luxurious. And after all of this, he is super badly injured and he's facing the final rapids, and he says that he faces them with excitement. All these words, I think, this unexpected phraseology kind of give a clue that Dickey is saying that Ed isn't transformed in the way that I think the reader would expect him to be. He isn't like as humbled and afraid maybe as he should be, which is kind of weird. So I think the point is that they face trials that should humble them, but they don't. In the after portion of the book, Bobby struggles with being physically emasculated, but he never does confront the issue, and he just avoids the other men, moving forward with his life at all costs. And Ed is averse to Bobby because he still sees him as weak, and he's kind of disgusted by it, which is not the right response either. Ed and Lewis continue practicing archery with apparently no conflicted or weird feelings over having murdered people with that weapon. Ed worries about being confronted with the events of the trip, but not out of remorse, but it seems like more of an aversion to being caught and punished. In the end, the relentless, arrogant masculinity still comes through. The men still use nature for their own purposes, which in this case is hiding bodies, and the people they killed have no value or meaning to them. They never consider those people's families or anyone who might care about them. So I think that my thesis is correct. Dickey cleverly presents a timeless critique on arrogant masculinity that withstands both trials and years. Thanks.